So what I'm going to be talking about today is, in fact, focusing on this transition that I've been making. We're beta testing. I mean, it's not really ended up being a beta test. It's got over 300 students in it. We thought it would be 30 students, but beta testing an online version of this Intro to Rome class. And it started out as a fully flipped course, so all lectures online, all class time devoted to practice. Total disaster, don't recommend it. Happy to talk to you about why I think it didn't work out that well. But what I then kind of went to is what I would call a modified flip or a blended class, where I now teach it, and I taught it to 400 students 3 times. I actually managed to get them to agree to let me teach it to 200 students, and mostly freshmen this semester, because the model is very much about how to learn, how to be a college student. And so I've got this amazing group. It feels incredibly intimate to have 200 students, which sounds crazy, but it actually is. And it really is, works perfectly to do what it's supposed to do. They had their first test just this past week, and the average in the class was over a 90, which sounds like, oh my gosh, you must give really easy tests and grade inflate. The average on a much easier version of this test several years ago was in the mid-70s, and that was usually adding a lot of extra credit points. So for me, I love it. I mean, it's been completely worth the work to create all of these digital assets, because it lets me shift out of class the stuff that I don't really need to be there to do. That they do need somebody explaining it beyond a textbook, but then they need me to check that they got it in class. But I can spend 2 minutes checking that they got it instead of 10 minutes lecturing about it. And then I can spend the time in class actually talking about either things that aren't in the book or that are way more complicated, and especially things that, as a professional classicist, I know are complicated. And so it lets me bring in my expertise in research expertise into the classroom in that regard as well. And I think makes a good argument for why classes, in fact, at any level, need to be taught by people who are, in fact, active in their fields, that we are bringing that into our classes on a regular basis. All right, let's see if we can get this to work. All right, so I think before you go into any kind of change, and really everything I say here applies, I'm talking about online, but really all online is just taking a bunch of digital assets and putting them together so that it's fully online. You can go from just one digital asset and mostly teaching face-to-face to completely online. It's a spectrum. So really everything I'm saying here applies broadly to however you want to integrate digital assets, the creation of them and then the deployment of them in a class. So I think, the sort of lost in translation part of my talk comes out of a kind of moment that I had when I was thinking about, it was about this time last year, I had this grant, was asked to try to create an online class. And especially in the humanities, and we've seen this with MOOCs, it's really difficult to think about how to do that. And hard to figure out, especially if you're not just lecturing, which I was not going to do. And so I started thinking about it in terms of, I was reading Latin one day, and I started thinking about how, it's actually kind of like teaching Latin, where when you're teaching Latin, especially, and I work on weird late Latin, and so even to people who read Latin, sometimes you have to explain things to them, that it's very much about thinking about what is the work something is doing. It's not a word-to-word translation. So I think one of the big problems that often happens when people are thinking about moving some or all of their class into the digital environment is trying to figure out what's the one-to-one translation, what's the exact equivalent. And so we see with MOOCs, for instance, the videotaped lecture. But then it turns out that's not actually the exact equivalent, because in fact you're missing out on all that sort of sense of presence of the professor, and so it's an imperfect kind of equivalent. And what's much better, I think, is to not try to figure out what's the sort of thing that looks like it, like the videotaped lecture, but rather thinking about, okay, well, if I'm in class and I am talking, what's the work that talk is doing? And what is the work that my presence in that room is doing? Why am I here now instead of at home in Texas live streaming this? Well, there's some work that's doing. And so what I started doing then, just kind of in my time that was so abundant, was thinking about the different parts of my class. And I did this while I was teaching it, and thinking about what is the work that is happening. And we did lots of surveys of students, and I'll talk about assessment and the importance of assessment, but really getting at what's the work that each part of my class is doing, that I'm doing, that my students are doing, and it just sort of happens somehow, and it's not totally clear how it's happening. And I sort of, when I try to explain it to people, so the Latinists in the room will understand this, that you have, when you teach first semester Latin and you're trying to teach certain kinds of constructions to students, and they want to translate things word by word. And so we have here our perfect passive periphrastic, where if you translate it word by word, it makes no sense. So you can see, when students just don't understand what they're doing, and you have to get them to think not word by word, but actual, like, what is this, the function, what is the syntactical function of this thing? Well, in a way, if you can think about your class is like a sentence, and each thing has a syntactical function there. Ideally, it has a syntactical function. And if it doesn't, one of the things you'll find out quickly is that it doesn't, and you don't need it in there. And so that's one of the reasons, even just thinking about doing some kind of course redesign tends to make most of us better teachers, is that we're actually thinking hard about what we're actually doing and what work it's doing and how day 1 connects to day 25. And it's not just walk in on day 1 and hope you're still alive on day 25. It's actually thinking about how to do all these things come together. And I think, it's very important as well. People, I think, have it, especially as a humanist, I have a natural tendency to kind of think online is inferior. And, I think we're starting to see some pushback to that. But I would argue there should be a lot more pushback to that notion. It's different. We can do different things online than we can do face-to-face. I think we do face-to-face education really, really well in this country in certain contexts. So at Notre Dame, you guys have a lot of resources. You have a great student-faculty ratio. You can do face-to-face really well. At UT Austin, for instance, we don't have those same resources. We can't do face-to-face very well at all, especially in the first 2 years. So for us, this kind of thinking is really important. But I would argue that it's also really important for smaller colleges who also do face-to-face really well. That there are things you can do online that you can't do face-to-face. And it's thinking about it in those terms. It's really thinking each of these media have different strengths and weaknesses. And that if part of what we're doing is training students to go out into the world, they are going to be working somewhat in online worlds. And knowing how to navigate in that world is really important. There are states that now mandate that students have to take an online class to graduate from high school. And a lot of that is precisely this recognition that they are probably going to have to operate in an online world for some part of their career. So you want to think about when you're figuring out what's the syntax of your course, and then breaking down those things into their components. So figuring out what does each thing do, and who's doing it. Am I doing it? Is the student doing it? Is it happening somehow in a way I'm not entirely sure? And is it some kind of interaction of the two? But it's really understanding how learning happens in your course. If you can't do that, it's very hard then to figure out how to design an experience where students are going to learn. You have to figure out first, how are they learning? And one of the best ways to do this is just start watching them. It's to do surveys. It's to ask them how they think they're learning. It's you observing, but it's also asking them what they think they're doing. And it's thinking about what kind of work does each component do for me in my class. And you would be surprised at what you think the work is versus what it actually is, and what you can get rid of and what you have to keep. And I'll just give one example. In my blended class, I did a discussion board, and we would do these twice a week except exam weeks. And part of this was it's a huge class, and I wanted them to actually have to make connections between things. But it quickly became clear that because it's 400 people and I only had one TA per 100 students, that even just with that, it was very hard to, you have to moderate it intensively, you have to give them a lot of feedback, and you have to be able to somehow, I mean, you can't have them posting every week. It's just way too much. And we use Piazza, and it's not very good for dividing up the, Piazza is not very good for dividing up the students into groups. We're trying it now, and it's still not very good at it. But one of the things, students always complained about Piazza and this discussion board. And some part of me was like, well, of course they do. They hate discussion boards. But at 3 semesters in, I thought, they're right. I like the discussion board because it's showing me all these cool things, like their ability as a class to do something. But for individual students, they're going in, they're posting something, maybe they're posting a follow-up, and then they're going out. They're not reading the whole thing. I don't have the assignment constructed in a way that requires that. And so if I'm actually looking at what work that assignment is doing, it's helping me in various ways. It's letting me talk about what the class was talking about, but it's not actually doing a lot of work for them. And so we've actually changed that now to a series of worksheets. So they still have to do the good part, which is think about things in cohesive terms and make connections across the material. But now we just follow it up with a couple of prompts. So there's the main prompt and then a couple of follow-up questions. And so it's actually now doing the work I wanted it to do and they don't complain about it, interestingly. I don't know why, but for some reason they don't complain about it. Thank you, sorry. I'll stop talking so much. So the theme song, I think, of anyone doing any kind of course transformation has to be whatever it is your kids are singing. I kind of joke, but like I have an Elsa doll in my office. And it is very much about letting things go. And if you're like me and kind of like perfection and you like things to work well the first time, this can be a really steep learning curve. Let's put it that way. You're gonna fail. It's just gonna happen. No matter what you do, no matter how hard you try, no matter how much planning you do, no matter how much experience you have, how many people you talk to, there's gonna be things that don't go right. And you just have to think of it as, it's a beta test. I mean, that's my new kind of thing, is it's a beta test. And I think it's been really helpful doing this online class because I've seen the curve with the blended class, and I see now like where it can end up. And so I'm like, okay, like, with the online, there's still these various kinds of hiccups, but we'll get there. Like, it takes some iteration. But it's hard, it's still hard, and every night I'm troubleshooting something. I have an instructor who's running each of the 2 sections actually, one for non-UT students, one for UT students, and each instructor they're new to it, like it's all, so I'm troubleshooting every night. And I sometimes just have to take a deep breath and say, let it go, it'll be okay. Delegate. There's one of the things I'll be talking about, these are team projects. And I know Elliot is talking a lot about this, but when we're talking about the integration of technology, when you're talking about video, you're talking about audio, graphics, these are team projects. You can be very low tech, and actually my online class is very low tech, but it still takes a team. I mean, I work really hard and I can't do it myself. It takes a team. You have to prioritize what matters, what can you let go, and what are you going to come back to in a future iteration. Communicate. So, if you are the team leader, which would argue the faculty member designing the course ought to be, and working in consort with especially a project manager. But it's really up to you to communicate, and I think academics are we're not good at that, and we're not good even at saying things like, good job, and way to go, and just all those things that, like, I mean, I'm not a big fan of business kind of moving into academia, but there is some of the kind of team mentality really is important. And, if you think, I played team sports as a kid, and a lot of those skills that I learned as a pitcher playing team sports, really I use now all the time. You want to congratulate people on a job well done, but also hold them accountable. There will be people that don't do what you need them to do. And when we're talking about having students do project-based learning, and team-based learning now, like they're actually learning good skills that I certainly didn't learn. And I've had to make some really hard decisions with people and, not exactly fire them, but kind of fire them. And, I mean, they didn't like literally lose their job, but to say, you're not doing what I need on this project. And I've asked you and you're just not doing it. And so I need someone else. And then finally, the good enough rule, which, people talk about this with parenting, totally that way with this. But it does have to be good enough. So there's this line where it's got to be good enough, but perfection, no. And you'll be amazed at what, in fact, good enough really is. As I said, it's very much about a team. And I think, especially when, it's very much like the sciences, in fact, and you think of labs and the way that labs run. And so for people in the natural sciences and STEM fields, this model has been much easier for them, I think, to embrace. For humanists, we've kind of been unsure exactly how to do it and what our role is. So these are kind of the main players. It's a big list of main players. And depending on what you're doing and how you design things, you'll use more or less of these different pieces. But these are just the main players on my team, for instance. And I would also say, I think one of the things that we're finding out is that, there's a kind of, at UT at least, this sense of like you build a team and then you go do things. And what I really found was actually it was better to bring people in as I needed them. And that the model that we were using is a kind of bidder-based model. So they're internal people, but you pay them as though they're external from your grants. And the problem with this is you'd have to say, well, I need a technologist. I'm not sure when I'll need them. I know what I need them to do, but it's dependent on 5 other people doing something. But I would just have to pay them for 3 months, no matter what, even though I actually only needed them for 2 weeks. So, and this is one of, when you're sort of thinking about like, well, how do you actually build infrastructure for this? This is what infrastructure people are thinking about. But on college campuses and when you're building courses, it is, I think, very much more about, because we don't control production quite in the same way. You need a content expert, and that content expert needs to have a lot of teaching experience because every single aspect of this is going to require their decision making. And one of the things that, I hope there are no administrators here who will smack me, but administrators like to say to me at least is, oh, well, you don't have to take care of that. You don't have to worry about that. The problem is I do have to worry about the graphics. Like I have to proofread them and make sure there are no typos in them, because there are in fact typos in them. And if Gracchus is spelled wrong, that's on me, not on the graphic designer. We have podcasts. I have to record the podcast in my voice to pronounce all the words, and then we actually they've hired students to read them, and then I have to edit them, proofread them, proof listen to them, and decide are they good enough. And okay, if they mispronounce nos homo, we kind of let it go. If they mispronounce sola, not so much. And you kind of decide, where's the line there on what you're willing to let go. But I'm involved in every single aspect of this. And so the notion that you can somehow, I will say a good project manager takes a lot of stuff off your plate, but it's still time consuming, and especially in that sort of development stage. So you're gonna have possibly an instructional designer. Assessment specialist is key. This is the person that's gonna tell you how to measure what students are learning and whether what you're doing is working, which is really important to know, because if it's not working, you wanna be able to change it. And things that you think are working, you'll find out don't work, and vice versa. And just having things from, having an exam score or something like that. It's nice when students score high on an exam, but it might be that you just wrote a bad exam, or they scored really low because you wrote a bad exam. Assessment specialists are also great for people like me that were not ever trained in pedagogy to learn how to actually write good questions. So that's been one of the great parts of doing this. I apologize. One of the great parts of doing this has been actually learning these basic pedagogical skills about, if you're asking an iClicker question in class, or you're asking a multiple choice question on a test, realizing, oh, when you put you know, which of these did not? There's a reason that more people miss that. And figure out, what are you trying to test in a particular question, and make sure that that's what you're actually testing in that question. Which, you know, I think we're getting better at training graduate students in pedagogy, but there's still a ways to go. All right, we should be able to. So these are, you know, some of the basic things. And then I think, you know, project manager, good project manager. You can have bad ones. I've had them. And you can have good ones. You want the good ones. I have a great one right now who just makes my life 20 times easier. He's also an audio engineer, so he can do that side of things. But, you know, you can also have ones that basically just continually ask you questions, and you feel like, why am I just not project managing myself? And then at some point, if you're actually running the course and you're not the one teaching it, you need a course coordinator. But that's a sort of different stage of things. So another big question that you have to ask yourself is the content creation question. And again, a lot of times people approach this thinking, I have to create all my own content. Now, I'm not going to go on about this, but I think when you're talking about blended versus online, this is a place where that distinction matters. And there's good data that shows that in a blended class, for instance, if you're doing some videotaped lectures, they should be yours. That students don't like it when it's not your lectures. It's just the way it is, and there's pretty good data showing this. It's different online, that you can, in fact, cull much more widely to put content together. And so when we built the online class, we did a lot of content curation. And in classics, we're very lucky because a lot of stuff is open access. Lots of images on Wikimedia, a ton of things on YouTube, getting to be more and more, there's BBC podcasts, there's the American Institute for Roman Culture that started to do a series on weird ancient Roman monuments. Not actually that weird, but stuff that you don't find on Khan Academy or something. So, just a tremendous, and I think in many, many fields, a tremendous amount of free material out there. The main issues are permissions and intellectual property. So you want to make sure you have the rights to it. You can do that by creating your own content, taking your own pictures, but it gets tricky, especially if you're a modernist, and very expensive. The stability of external resources, that's been a little bit of an issue, and we expect that will be an ongoing issue, that even from the time that we created the course, we finished in August, some links have gone dead. And so, we have to check them each time, and sometimes just delete them, sometimes we can find a replacement, but you're reliant on other people to maintain those links. And so that is an issue if you're relying on that. The notion of coherence, it doesn't work very well if you're just putting a bunch of different stuff together without a coherent narrative. So you have to think about it still as you're curating, but you are the curator. And it's still a voice, and whether it's your presence or not, your voice as the creator has to be there weaving everything together. And I'll show you some ways that we've done that. And then, I think finally, one of the arguments for trying to curate as opposed to create, besides the fact that it's cheaper, is that there's a lot of talk now about getting students to see the internet as what people call an open learning ecosystem. But really to understand that learning isn't something that just happens in a classroom. It happens all over. It happens when you're Googling something on your phone. And you would think that that would be obvious, but it actually isn't. And I know in the online class I had to explain to them, because they kept posting questions that they just needed to Google the answer. And I said to them finally, it's open book, open Google the answer. The Wikipedia article is good on this. Part of the point of this class, and I explained to them that part of the point of the class was learning how to critique internet sources. But it was amazing that I had to actually say, Google is good, it's okay. Because they would have Googled where to go eat or which bar was the best bar. But Googling, who a character was or what happened at Lake Trasimene, somehow, if they can't find it immediately in the textbook, then their first instinct is, I have to ask the professor. And so trying to retrain them into this notion that, no, you can find these answers yourself. That's the amazing world we live in, is that these answers are actually out there. So this is an example, just a screenshot of how we constructed this. And if anyone's interested in kind of looking behind the scenes, I'm happy to facilitate that. But this is just an example of kind of the different kinds of resources that we would integrate into a module. So it starts off with a question that essentially comes out of the readings. And then a map that we got off of Wikimedia, pretty easy to do, saved it, it's ours now. And then our voice, so a little bit explaining stuff. And so this the thing with the map all the way to the bottom is there's no question in there, it's all content delivery. But it's an image, and then it's our own voice writing. And I actually there were 3 of us who participated in the writing and edited each other's work. And so it's not even one person's voice. And then there's a video that's on YouTube about the Phoenicians, and it's about 20 minutes long. And then there's actually a BBC podcast as well about the Phoenicians. And we mark that, if you're interested, which shows, these are optional things for those of you that are really gung-ho. But one of the things we're doing is actually collecting the numbers on, well, how many of them keep going? So, we clearly mark what's required and then what is like extra stuff. And we're very interested in looking at, when we include this extra stuff, how many keep going. And just the preliminary information suggests quite a few do. And this is what I would argue is one of the advantages of online, is, in your classroom, that student who's super curious, they have to come to your office hours or maybe try to find it on their own. Online, you just put it all here. You mark what you have to know and what's extra, and then you let them do what they want to do. And, those really gung-ho students, they're watching videos and podcasts. So as I said, I think one of the main issues that comes up is do I lecture or don't I lecture? And one of my sort of primary commitments, and this came out of flipping, actually, where I spent a summer recording myself lecturing. So I have, 50, 20-minute long lectures. And we do post these on the online class in a kind of hidden corner. The students can get to it, but we don't want it to be the main thing. We say this is like extra if you really need it or you just love lecturing. And for what we can tell, they're not really using it that much. And partly why we posted it is to make the argument that we don't need to update these. That I don't need to go back in the studio this summer and record them in the nice fancy new studio with 3 cameras. I think for some classes you would do more of this, and especially more modern topics where there was less content. But for my particular class, I really took what is called the constructivist approach, and this is actually, again, coming out of STEM fields, where it's very much about, instead of, if you think about the traditional lecture that I'm doing even, where I'm talking and delivering a narrative. Well, the other way is to ask a series of questions and insert some content where the student constructs the narrative. And that's really what we're doing in the online class, because we know that they don't particularly like or know how to watch lectures. It's very hard to make them interesting. It seems kind of weird if you start cracking jokes to yourself, to the camera. Like all those things that you do in class, and all the ways that, like for me, I establish, I make jokes about my cats, or I make jokes about all the terrible ways Romans kill each other. And so you develop a persona, and we all probably do this. It's very, very hard to do that in a videotaped lecture without looking really cheesy. I also decided to make it about the content. So, I know I have great content. And I didn't want to be stuck teaching the class forever and ever and ever. So from the beginning, I designed it so that I never have to teach it. My face is nowhere in this class. It's in these lectures, although you could take the face out, but it's nowhere else. My voice is there, my brain is there, it's my class, it's my IP, but it's not my face. So we have another instructor teaching it. As far as the students know, he designed it. So that was something I did really deliberately. I think for sustainability in particular is probably a good thing to think about. But again, if you're blending, it's different. Like I think there, where students actually see you, they're fine with seeing your face, and it makes sense because it's your class, it's your content. But in a situation where, like with an online class, this may well run with graduate students running it or other faculty. I didn't want to be committed for 15 years to running it. Which, I think with the MOOCs, this has been one of the issues. Like on the one hand, you get the cult of celebrity, but on the other hand, it becomes, I think, a little too much about the professor, a little bit less about the content. Go ahead.
You said it was your IP, but other people are teaching it as if it's theirs. Did you get some extra compensation for that? How is that your IP if it's just being used by anybody?
IP in the sense that I have an understanding, and yes, these are things institutions are negotiating. Mm-hmm. But at the moment, if UT tried to actually run it without my permission, I could sue them. So it's my IP in that sense. But did I get any compensation? No. I'm working 30 hours a week now on it for nothing. Someday, supposedly, maybe. I think, that's what, the issue of so you've created this artifact like a textbook almost.
Which someone gives you 29 cents for each one that's sold for that.
Right, and I think UT, for instance, that's the model they're probably going to adapt as a royalty model. But there's lots of complications in it, and I think I just kind of said, I'm just going to do this for the experience of doing it. Eventually, I think there will be much clearer models about, but the main thing for me was that they couldn't run it without me saying it's okay. So, right now the staffing, I hired someone to do it with my grant money. I had to pay all the staffing costs. In the spring, it's going to switch over to the university. We'll see what happens, and we'll see if it runs, because I've been very clear that it has to run the way it was designed. And so if they try to have one person teach 300 students, it's not going to work. And I have the right to say, okay, no. And I'll probably, one of the ways I'll recoup some compensation is the extension school also offers a section where students pay tuition. It's not UT students, it's adults and people. So I will probably teach that section and get extra salary that way. But I do think this has been one of the ongoing issues, is how do you compensate faculty for their time? Do you give them time off? Do you give them summer funding? Do they get ongoing royalties? And these are issues that are being decided. They're nowhere near decided, and different schools have different takes on it, roughly speaking. As far as for me at least, it was the IP that mattered. I just didn't want somebody else being able. There was an article in the Chronicle, I think, about somebody literally having their class taken.
Last week?
Yeah. And that I didn't want happening. And so I made sure I was covered in that way, but otherwise it's very I think
that person had that same agreement, and now she got $17,500.
Well, no, she didn't have any agreement. That was her problem, and they just said develop this course, and for some reason she just did it, and she just didn't know that meant that they could. And she did get a settlement, but
because they said anyway.
Yeah, but it was a weird, and this is, I think, one of the issues is, when we're, as teachers, we're used to sharing. And we're not used to, having this sense of, I own this thing, and I want to make money off this thing. And so, but it's complicated, because if your university is making money off of it, then, you certainly want to at least be aware of that. And that was, in that case, the issue. But my particular take on this was, especially when it's offered to UT students, that, it's essentially me offering, another class. Nobody's making money exactly. The college gets enrollment credit, which is not actually tied to their funding anyway. I think that's one issue that all of us that are involved in this feel a lot of how's this going to play out? I do want to say lecture, I'm not one of these people that says, all lecture is bad. And of course it's not. The main thing is that when you're doing it in digital form, it's really hard to do it well. And you can be a great lecturer in a classroom and look terrible on camera. And most of us were not actors. And you think about it, when your students are watching things on their iPad or their their computer, what they're watching are professional actors. And so then you next to them, like you look kind of klutzy and you're like searching for words, and I hadn't really thought about that until, doing that myself and watching myself and watching, professional actors. But it's just hard to do it well. And as I said, it's hard to kind of create a personality without just being completely over the top. I believe it can be done, it's just hard to do. It's very time consuming. Even, just the time, I broke my foot just from standing still for so many hours. I got a stress fracture in the bottom of my foot. So I seriously, like I joke that I'm gonna sue the liberal arts ITS for workplace injury because they made me stand on a mark, and you can't move. Because, this was, I think now this was a few years ago, now you can actually walk around and cameras can follow you. It's very expensive to film and to edit and to re-edit, and it ages really quickly. So my lectures are 2 years old, and they look like I did them 10 years ago. And a lot of that's the technology ages. I wore the same shirt, and it had a very neutral background, but it's just the technology ages, and so they just look less cool than they did 2 years ago. So this is what I do. I don't lecture, but we do use podcasts. So this is another example where you can see kind of the mix of questions, images, and then there's a place where we wanted to talk about something, it's a sort of more abstract idea, which patron-client relationships in ancient Rome. There's not really a good, short, 5-minute thing you can find that really gets at the complexity of that the way we wanted. And so those were places where we did podcasts. And we do probably, depending on the module, like somewhere between about 8 and 12 or so, and do it usually on things like Roman marriage, or it's usually conceptual things where the stuff you find online is for a popular audience, and it would be very hard for students to find a good resource, or like the Wikipedia article is good, but it's too long and too complicated. Or a place where we want synthesis, and the textbook doesn't do a good job of it, or whatever. But we always have a very deliberate reason of we're doing a podcast here because we need something. And they're about 3 to 5 minutes long. As I said, we have students read them. That has the downside of occasional mispronunciations of Latin words. I think it has the upside of it's again that multivocality. It's not one person's voice. Doesn't age. It's not, we just temporarily inserted these avatars. That's one of the good enough things that we'll replace in spring, because we were just rushing to get this out. But so far the feedback on the podcast, they listen to them, they seem to get them, and that 3 to 5 minutes seems to be a good amount for. Also, sometimes we deliver the content in text form, so it's a way of kind of mixing it up as well.
Do you offer the text so people don't have to listen?
We don't, and that's another thing that we're doing now is transcribing. So I write all the podcasts and I have the transcriptions, but we just don't, we're literally, today we're releasing a module, so it's we're just doing it as we go. And the podcasts are one of the things that we're doing now, but for ADA reasons, and also students just sometimes like to read better, in the spring we'll have the transcripts up there. And all of my lectures actually are transcribed, so they have that. But again, I think when you're approaching this, it's about thinking about what are the benefits of online space, not does it suck? Why is it worse than face-to-face? And why am I being forced to do this? Or why do I feel guilty about doing this? For one thing, it does create this impression of personalization. And I say impression because it's not really personalized, especially if you've got 300 students. But it is personalized to the extent that when you're teaching 30 students, you might be interacting one-on-one at any given time with that student, but not the rest of the class. Well, in an online environment, you're actually always interacting one-on-one. That one student has to do every single thing. And they get feedback, and some of that can be automated and some of it not. But it does, in fact, require much more engagement from the students. And they will complain about this sometimes, but that's how they learn. You can give them very immediate feedback. So, in this is built in Canvas, it has immediate feedback that we give them. And when you're an experienced teacher, you tend to know where people go wrong with your content. And so you can say, you know, oh, if you put this answer, it's probably because you thought this. Go check this page here, and kind of get them so that they're correcting themselves, and they get in that habit of correcting themselves immediately instead of just going, oh, got it wrong, oops, and moving on. One of the things that we're able to do here that we're not able to do, even in small classes, like graduate seminars maybe, is where I can do close reading really effectively. But, you know, certainly not even in a 100-person class, can I do close reading of primary sources, visual and literary. We have a ton of primary sources in the online class. And that's, I would say, the biggest difference between the online class and the campus course is just the amount of primary sources that we're able to put in the online class, and really require them to understand them and to walk them through how to make sense of them. And for my field, understanding how to read primary sources and understanding evidence is huge. And it's something I do in the campus course, but again, you maybe 2 people answer a question, and you can try, and we do as much as we can, but there's just limits to what you can do when you have a larger number of students. Whereas if it's literally one-to-one, you can do so much with primary sources. Collaboration, also, you can do a lot to encourage them, and they tend to seek it out because they're online. And I have not, that's another one of these, we'll get to it, have not done a lot of facilitating collaboration. We're still working out a lot of kinks with Canvas, actually. But one of the things Canvas is supposed to be good at is allowing for peer collaboration. I would say the biggest reason students take online classes is not because they're looking for an easy class, it's the flexibility issue and accessibility. And our student body is getting to be increasingly commuter-oriented. Lots of them work more, 30 hours a day, sometimes, or 30 hours a week, sometimes even full-time. And so the majority of people, when we did a pre-class survey in the online class, said they were taking it for reasons of flexibility. Also, like natural science majors that had labs all day, and it just didn't fit in their schedule. And then it lets you integrate visual and audio much more smoothly. So, in class we show stuff and we do stuff, but you're always like kind of going from this switch to this switch to this switch. And here it's a much smoother kind of, where you're not worried about, oh no, class is running out and I'm not through the YouTube video yet. And so again, we were able to actually put in a lot more both visual and audio stuff into the online. And so this is an example actually of the close reading that we do. So again, a lot of our texts are available in translation, pretty good translations. So we can say, go read this thing, now answer this question. And then here's, a follow-up question. And they get feedback on, some of these are short answer. So the first 2 here are actually multiple answer, which is also a fun way to make sure they really know something. Because they might get 1 or 2 right, but they don't get all of them right. And then the third one is actually a short answer question that says, okay, now compare. So first they read one account, Plutarch, then they read another historian, Cassius Dio, and then it says, now compare these. And that's actually a short answer that we'll go in and give comments to. We'll give written comments to that. And then it says, again, just a multiple choice question at the end. And so, a mix of, different kinds of things. You're reading 2 different kinds of sources, you're comparing them. You can do this in a class. It's just a lot harder to do, especially at scale. But to be able to do this kind of close reading with 300 people is really pretty amazing. And getting them to think about, look, we have 2 sources. They disagree. Why do they disagree? And the kind of depth of thinking that that's now requiring them to do. And so, yeah, this is what the short answer thing would look like. And then the TAs for the course, and I have the course staffed with 4 of them, in addition to the instructor plus me, and we go in and actually all the short answers, we give pretty detailed feedback to them, and that's one of the things, but Canvas is not very good at facilitating, and I'm trying to figure out if there's a way to make this more like where they do some of their own self-correction now that they've had a few of these modules graded. And then, so like, there's like sub-modules in each module. And so maybe like for 3 of the modules we do them and 3 they do. But that's one area where it's just, it takes a ton of time to, but I think early in the course that feedback is hugely important. But we're trying to think of ways to maybe cut back on that. So gamification, everyone's talking about, you know, gamifying things. There's really easy ways to do this cheaply, and that's what we did. So one of the things you can do are just decision tree games, which for Roman history work really well. Like, you are so-and-so, what are you going to do in this situation? And this came out of, I teach in my regular class, it's ethics flagged. So we do a lot of ethical analysis. And then somebody actually who's a doctor was showing me like the way they've done this on PowerPoint, where you just make links. And so it's like a case study, and okay, you have a patient who comes in with these symptoms. What do? You know, click here, click here, click here. And you can set these up on PowerPoint and just load it into your learning management system, and the students go through and learn about, like, well, if you're the e-dial, like, what are the things that are sort of around your decision making, and what if you do this thing and all the people rebel, you know, and so it's a really good way of, you know, partly just changing it up, but it's super cheap. I mean, it's brain power, that's all. And then also, we have actually sort of built a game into the course itself. So I don't do like a special unit on domestic architecture or on like household objects. But we decided that we could actually build a game around this that would sort of start with the beginning of the semester and end with the end, and we just called it Atrium. And so what we do, we gave them a game board that's an empty atrium, and then we've embedded all these different domestic objects, not all of them actual ancient objects, which you'll see in a second, but got the graphic designer to just make stickers out of pictures. And these are just embedded throughout the module. And so, you know, some in really obvious places and some in very hidden places. And we don't tell them how many there are. We just say, you know, collect stickers. So, like, here you have the impluvium is what it's called, but the pool that's in the center of the atrium. So they have to know, like, well, what is this and where does it go? Because what they have to do is decorate their atrium. And they just had to finish the module they just finished. They submit it for review by this time it's the console. But, you know, as we go through the semester, it'll be different people. And so they get graded on, like, and it's all extra credit, but they get graded on, like, did you know where your impluvium is supposed to go? And so they have to, you know, we give them sites to look up. So the scene, we give them scenarios for each module. It was a dinner party, and they had to decorate for the dinner party and then show it was actually their uncle, Censorius, the Censorius guy, who doesn't want the family to look bad. So he insisted on coming and looking at their atrium before they invited guests. And so they have a bowl of figs there and a lamp. But, you know, these are all things, like if you say lamp to the average, you know, chemistry student, they're thinking, you know, like thing on a table. They don't know what a Roman lamp looked like. This is a really fast and easy way for them to learn what a Roman lamp looked like. And they do things, what they do, and we told them this is fine to do, is if you don't know what something is, post it on the discussion board and we'll help you. And so then, you know, someone will post it, and we never answer these particular ones, we just let the students answer each other's, and they always do. And so, you know, then you have that peer learning happening. But I never have to talk about what a Roman lamp is. They just find the sticker and do it. So this is somebody who submitted their completed atrium with all of its decorations. So we just took, I think it's maybe from Herculaneum, like a decent looking atrium, and then put in things, so like the table wasn't actually ancient, some of the meat dishes and stuff, but like we had forks and spoons, but there's a fresco up there, there's another one up there, a bust, a statue, there's a wine jug, there's a few other, like some other things, and there's going to be, so we're also showing them, in addition to what all these objects are, we're showing them what happened in an atrium. And so one of the scenes is going to be a funeral, so we have a corpse that they're going to find at some point. So, but it's about showing them, like, you might not expect, like, that you'd have, like, the display of a body in an atrium. But, in ancient Roman culture, you did. So this has been, it's been interesting because at first some of the students were just, first of all, they were very confused, like, what is this? And secondly, some of them were like, oh my God, it's so lame, like, I'm so cool. And then they kind of got into it because they realized, not just that it was extra credit, but actually that, oh, like, I'm actually learning about stuff. But this is one place where I'll do more kind of before the class, like, explaining this is what it is. Because there definitely was that, like, why are we collecting stickers kind of moment. And this is just what the organization looks like. It's one of the things I'll say is you want to have if you're doing a fully online class, very structured, repetitive organization to train people in what to expect each time, because we'll talk about in a second, people, no matter what, are confused. Like, even when they do things right, they're confused because they just think, like, they're used to going into a classroom. They know what to do when they walk in a classroom. And they feel like they don't know what to do when they're in an online class. And so having some kind of orientation and then a set, like in our case, we chose the modular structure, but it's very predictable. And we're now on module 5, I think, and like they've got it. So there's 10 total, so there's some hope that. A lot of people will say, especially in the humanities, I'm not going to modularize. You can't modularize a humanities class. That's for the sciences. We all modularize. They're called midterm exams. They're called class periods. We all do this already. And it's actually, again, thinking about it as a strength. It's thinking about how do you want to organize your information to tell a story. And one of the kind of fun things for the classicists in the room, if you've seen Harriet Flower's book on the Roman republics, where she's talking about the sort of different narratives you can have of the Republic. And the evidence kind of can lead you to a bunch of different narratives. And one of the things that we sort of realized is, by accident, I had actually chosen, so she's arguing for a certain, like that our old narrative is actually not quite right. And I realized, oh, I've actually accidentally endorsed this kind of more new narrative that she would argue for. But it does really get you thinking about sort of, well, how are you putting the pieces together and creating a sense of causality and relationships between your content, which we do anyway. We just don't realize it. And we do it when we give a midterm exam and everyone learns a bunch and then they move on. So I think in that regard it's one of those questions that is kind of moot. So orienting your students, this is hugely, hugely important. And it's something I think when I first flipped my class, I didn't know, no one told me. And I was teaching in the classroom, like why did I need to orient them? And I will say one of the things I'm noticing with the online class, it's much less extreme, but because we're better at orienting. But it's that same thing in more kind of minute terms of just a sense of disorientation and confusion from some students, and especially in the first month. And over stuff that you just wouldn't expect. You're like, but it's clearly explained in the syllabus, or we've said this 40 times. But realizing that when you're, and I think this changes over time as more and more students get used to taking these kinds of classes, but you really do have to invest a lot of time in just making sure everything is laid out clearly. And I think with the online class, we only decided to go live, basically we were forced to, 10 days before the semester started. And it was because there were 300 people signed up for it. And so, they had like just changed who was overseeing the program, and there's all kinds of craziness going on. So we just thought, okay, well, we'll wait a semester. And then all of a sudden it was like, no, we're gonna go live. And so, we were rushing to get just stuff out there. And so kind of my normal, like, have all documentation in place and every topic covered didn't happen as much. It happened, but not as much. And so, and the issues where we've seen a few problems have been very much around orientation. One of the places is etiquette. It's explained to students how to be a student online, what is good etiquette, that a discussion board is a classroom, that cursing or yelling at your fellow students or yelling at the instructor, not appropriate on a discussion board. And we've actually got a case with the Student Judicial Services over a student who acted very, very badly on the discussion board. And interestingly, they don't know what to do with it either because they don't understand online. You have to be very responsive for that first month especially. And I think this is very much about creating a presence. But one thing that I think my team has done really well, though it's been more me and another person rather than the instructors, have been really responsive. And so the students now know that if they have questions, they'll get answers pretty quickly, and the number of questions has gone way down. But that first month, you're probably gonna get a lot of questions and a lot of basic ones. I use Piazza because it crowdsources, and you can just refer back when a question has been asked. But being online a lot is really important, or having notification that you've gotten a question, and getting on and answering it. And I've had a real hard time getting each of my instructors to actually get this point. They both have a lot of teaching experience, but I can't get them to understand that waiting 24 hours is not acceptable in this world. And I've ended up just doing a lot of, I kind of gave up. And, but that's been, I would say, one of the hardest things. Giving detailed feedback. Again, training, whether it's you or other people, but especially those first few modules, you give the detailed feedback then the students know what to do, and you see the vast improvement. And I think at that point you can start to then transition some of the feedback work onto them. And we'll be experimenting a little bit with that. And then doing an orientation module. Just having, first of all, so they know what they're getting into, but also so they practice all the things they're going to do in the class. And it lets you give them, go sign up for this and all the logistics that has to be done. But having an actual module where they have to figure out what it is, and if they really hate it, that's their chance to bail, rather than waiting to get into the content. And it gives you a sense of who they are. So we did, how can you contact the course instructor? Yes, do not follow the instructor home. But and it's a way of, you can work in your sense of humor. We did a number of things. We asked them, we showed them, a picture of the Coliseum and said, what does this make you think of? And people wrote all, ice cream or whatever, pasta. But it's just a way of, make sure they read the syllabus, make sure they understand the basic rules of the class, and that they are getting comfortable in the medium a little bit. Because they really will be uncomfortable, no matter how much they might have taken other online classes, but it's amazing. And this is an example from Piazza. Somebody says, I'm confused about the discussion groups. And the answer to her question is, you did everything right. So she's confused even though she did everything right. And this is very, very common in the especially first 3 weeks or so, that they will have done everything they're supposed to do, and then they'll post saying, I don't understand. And you spend half an hour tracking down, and you're like, but you did everything. Everything's fine. Oh, okay.
I think they need a lot of validation in the beginning.
Exactly. And we, I think, forget how much we give it to them in our face-to-face classes, and they just feel it coming from us. When we nod our head and we say, our body language. We're not there to do this, so they're like, oh, wait, am I right? Am I, and especially, I think, this generation coming to us from high schools where they've been given a lot of, and their lives have been pretty tightly controlled by adults. And so, part of the good part is you're kind of saying, no, you're empowered now to learn for yourself, but realizing it's a transition, that really you've got to carefully think about that transition. And not just expect them to just know it. And likewise, don't expect your instructors, whether it's you or someone else, don't expect them to know how to teach online. And I will say this has actually been my biggest stress with the online class. Getting stuff done and ready and proofread and Canvas not breaking down has been stressful. But much more surprising to me, I have two very experienced teachers, and they have different kinds of experience, and one is very social media savvy, the other not, but they've had a tremendously hard time running the class. One, because it's at scale, and that's actually the biggest issue. And we were having some issues last night with a student, and he kept saying, I see what you mean about teaching at scale now. It's like, yeah, you know, some of this you just learn the hard way. But it's also, you know, it's that responsiveness. Like, if you're teaching Latin 3 days a week, you're just not used to being that available. Your students aren't, you know, and I think you're just not used to having to like answer questions really fast. But if you do this enough, you realize if you answer those questions really fast at the beginning, then they go away. And so a month in, you're not really answering any more questions. So it's a completely front-loaded kind of work. The technology can be very hard to manage for some people. And that, again, has been an issue with these instructors. And then just sort of basic content expertise. One is a content expert, one is so-so, and that has turned out to, like, I thought it wouldn't be such an issue. It's been a little bit more of an issue. And so, yeah, but being, you know, realizing that if you're not the one teaching 30 students and you're actually teaching a larger number, you've got to actually train people. It's not intuitive how to teach in this mode. And, you know, basically you have to learn and then you have to teach other people how to do it. And there's getting to be more online classes by people who are teaching how to teach in the online mode. These are just, again, some of the, I think, basic challenges that come up. And I've touched on most of these points. I think one of the big ones is structuring the work for the students. In my campus course, we give weekly quizzes so they really can't procrastinate. That's why they score so well. In the online class, we can follow when they submit the module, and they actually crashed the system, the first module, because they were all working on it until midnight. Like, out of 300, I think 83 had submitted it by 5 p.m., and it was due at midnight. Now, I will say, after module 3 and the first exam, the most common comment on the survey about what are you going to do different was, I'm going to spread out my work. And we are seeing that, actually, that they're making that adjustment. And that's what I also like about the digital asset thing is I don't have to say, you guys are procrastinating, this is bad for you. They figure it out, and they make the adjustment. The thing we haven't really figured out, and I think is the hardest, is social learning, and especially at scale. Like, how do you get students interacting with each other, teaching each other? Our campus-based students, I think they are studying in groups. Like, we know some more social learning is happening there. The extension school students, these are people that have full-time jobs. And that sort of trying to figure out how to work social learning in, because it's really important. And they see in an online environment, they seek it out. They seek contact with each other, or some number do. And trying to figure out how to facilitate that, but not make it necessarily a graded part of the class, because not everybody wants it. That's part of why they've signed up for online. So we do online discussions and we do them once a week in the online class. And they're mediated, and they seem to do a fair amount to, like, at this point, students are in contact with each other. They're in set groups of 50, and so that's helped some. And like, this is just Piazza that we use. And so these run from like Sunday to Tuesday. And you know, the answers vary in quality, but we do a lot of, you know, if you want good answers, you have to moderate heavily and give them a lot of feedback. This is an example of, you know, sort of another discussion where the LJ is one of the moderators who's gone in there and given follow-up. It's time-consuming to do, and this has been another issue with the instructors, actually, is making them realize it takes time to do this, but if you want good discussion and you want the students to actually be making those connections, you have to do this kind of moderation. Exams are still another issue, I think, that we're struggling with. So with the modules, we use mastery quizzes at the end of each module, and they have to get 95% before they can move on. So, and it scrambles them and so forth. So that works, I think, pretty well, although it's open book. You know, they could cheat, or, you know, I mean, we don't care. Like, basically, we just say you have to get 95%. They do 3 midterms, the campus course students, and they have to take them. We proctor the exams. So that's kind of our way of controlling things. The extension school, we are trying to figure that one out. And what we did this time was we put the exam in the learning management sort of thing. We watched how they took it. We put a time limit on it. We also made half of the short answer by Skype, so it was oral. So they weren't going to get an A or B if they really didn't know stuff. And it seems to have, like, the grades seem to have matched up pretty well to how they did on the oral part. So we're thinking, but that works because there are 20 students in that section. Basically, someone's going to have to get a proctoring software or a proctoring service or a test, if it's on campus, a testing service that is going to do this. And we'll see how fast that happens. I know there are companies doing it, but that's probably the solution ultimately here if we're going to be giving credit for these courses. If you're not giving credit, it doesn't matter, but if you are, part of your responsibility is making sure that the credit is real. I think, though, again, in terms of kind of the most frustrating aspect, and not to end on a note of what's been the challenge, has actually been the technology. And this isn't actually surprising, probably, but a lot of this is that our ideas are outpacing where the technology is. And so the platforms right now, edX, Canvas, we still need coders coming in and working with faculty who are doing this kind of work and saying, I need this platform to be able to do X, Y, Z. And that's coming and it'll come fast, but that's, I think, one of the big areas where a lot of improvement can be made. And then just training instructors in how to teach in this mode and getting students comfortable in this mode and figuring out the logistics like exams. So, but overall, as I said, I think it's certainly, it's coming, it's here. And it's not a bad thing. It's simply a different way of offering courses that let us do different things with our content. And I think that's a really important thing. If you're thinking about how to do this and what to do, it's really important to not go into it thinking this is somehow inferior and I'm pressured to do this because my institution wants me to. But actually thinking, what can I do in this space that I can't do in another space? That's where you're really going to have successes. I'll shut up now.